give me 2 minutes and I'll pass the floor to Mr. Pietro.
Good. So now I'll wait just 1 more minute, then we start.
Great. So Pietro, we are live now on our YouTube and all the website. So I would like to hand on the floor to you to launch this webinar. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, so dear speakers, honorable guests, welcome to this session that will put cities and local administration under the spotlight of sustainable development goals. My name is Pietro Florio and I'm from the European Commission, JRC. I'll be moderating this session. Just a few instructions before we start. We have 1 hour, 40 minutes presentations regarding SDG implementation at the local level. So panelists are asked to kindly stick to the schedule of 25 minutes per presenting institution. I will take care of sharing the screen and progressing in the slides to your invite. There is unfortunately no time for live discussion or questions. So please, those who are listening can post their questions in the question and answer button or in the chat, and some of us will take care of answering. Then for any technical issues, there's the chat, and our colleagues at UNITAR will try to help you at their best. So now, without further doing, I will invite Alessandra, who's head at our unit at the European Commission, the head of the Disaster Risk Management Unit, to give us an inspirational introductory speech to this session. Thanks, Alessandra. The floor is yours.
Many thanks, Pietro. And as I said, good afternoon or good morning to all participants to this very, very important session, I have to say. I really hope that it will bring some concrete ideas and some concrete opportunities for cities to help them in the implementation of the SDGs. I am indeed Alessandra Zampiri and I work at the Joint Research Center. This is the science and knowledge service of the European Commission. My colleagues with me today, and also the others that you cannot see today, we are daily busy with producing knowledge and filtering this knowledge, make it available to practitioners, policymakers in very many different fields. And today specifically, we hope to be able to present and to manage the knowledge that we carry out and that we are producing, specifically relevant for this session and for cities. Indeed, cities are interaction multipliers. This exposed them to big risks, and the recent COVID pandemics has clearly shown this to everybody. But risk and crisis always come with great opportunity. I have spent this week discussing with the member states of the European Union how to design resilience goals. And resilience, which is really a buzzword, but we really need to believe in this concept, is not only the concept of being able to absorb the shocks. It is really the idea that we have to be able to react to crisis and to shocks and come out of crisis and shocks in a better way, in a better, healthy and wealthy society. And this is what we have to build all together. And cities are frontliners for this exercise. So I really hope to see also the city engaged in that exercise. They are, cities, certainly the laboratory for the future. In fact, the most urgent SDGs affecting larger populations shares belong to urban areas. And cities are also the place of the interlinkages among the SDGs, and where these interlinkages are boosted, they are the catalyzer for change, the starting engine for a post-pandemic recovery, for sure. So this very important local dimension of the SDGs means that municipalities and cities are not only implementing agencies, they really have to come up with the ideas and they really have to carry out the work. Their challenges and opportunities in achieving the SDGs must be recognized. So they really have a lot of hard work, but they also must take the recognition, the prize for these efforts. But this also means, and I know very well because I've been working with many cities and municipalities, not all of them has huge capacities in terms of human resources to be able to be always able to master technology or to be aware of the most recent research results available. And that's where we have to help. We really have to help municipalities and cities. Hence this session, as I said, I really hope that it will be concluded with concrete possibilities, tools, and ideas for cities on how to implement this local dimension of the SDGs. Remote sensing, for sure, offers the opportunity to, is one of the technologies to be used. It offers the opportunities to democratize the collection of the data, but also to really implement the SDGs on a practical level at the local level. And also in progress planning at the smallest possible place. So this is a very important technology that today we are going to present to you how fast you can use it without becoming remote sensing expert, all of you. And also this is the task of science. I told you at the beginning of my short introduction that our role here at the JSC is not only to produce results, evidence, and data, and models and algorithms, but really to make this available in an easy way to those who need to implement policies like this one. And this is also what we want to do today and to present to you today. My idea is that science must be solid in its result, but it must also simplify the life of the practitioners. It must offer simplified tools and opportunities. But of course, we are also here to spread the use of technology for empowering even the most remote areas of the planet for sustainable change. So today you will see some results of our work, and I am very happy, for example, that we have been reaching out, we've been working for this, for example, with the degree of urbanization trainings. We have been reaching out to not only Europe, but really the whole world. And we have now requests from countries in Africa or in other regions, really asking us to help them to define what a city is. Because at the end of the day, we must also know what cities are and where they start and where they stop. And this is one of the presentations that we will deliver today. I will not take more of your time because I'm sure you're more curious to understand everything about the toolbox and the other tools that will be presented in the session today. So with this, I thank you for having invited me to give this short introductory remarks. You are in the very good hands of my colleagues, and I wish you a very successful event, which will be very successful if you can conclude it with tools and ideas on how to use all these things that will be presented today. Pietro, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks, thanks, Alessandra, for this nice introductory perspective. So now we will move directly to the perspective of the geographers and their ways, their upcoming ways to assess to help local administration assess their progress in urban-related goals based on satellite imagery. So I invite Monica to go to the floor and present the presentation that I will share right
Yes, please,
now.
if you can share. So thanks a lot, Pietro, and a great introduction, which I think it puts everything nice into the scene. So I will talk very briefly over a toolkit which we have been developing in the last 1-2 years, I would say, And I will talk on the first part. My colleague Aji Kawada will talk on the second part, and this will be followed then by a very specific example from our colleague Bob Shen, which will show you a very hands-on example of what is containing in this toolkit. And exactly the toolkit is aiming to do to produce tools and data and bring them close to the people who actually need those tools and data and make them understandable for local SDG monitoring. If you could move to the next slide, please. So the toolkit is an online resource for sustainable city and communities. It's very much targeted on the SDG 11 and the new urban agenda. And we have been categorizing the tools and data under these 4 larger topics, which is housing, open space, and urbanization and public transport. This toolkit has been evolving and developed by a large partnership, which is also continuously increasing, and is also a large part of this toolkit is also bringing people together, bringing very diverse people together, the Earth observation community together with people who are really needing these tools for local SDG reporting. Please, next. So what we will talk today is a general introduction about the toolkit, a bit about how Earth observation and SDG measures link, then to get you an overview on how to use the toolkit, and then my colleague Archie will talk about some COVID-19 related resources as part of the toolkit. Next, please. So this great quote from Thomas Paine shows that what we aim is unity. So what we really aim to is to increase the use of Earth observation for urban SDG monitoring by a very strong coalition of partners which drive this use further. Thanks. Next. So the first part is the introduction to the Earth observation toolkit, and to give you an understanding of what is Earth observation and how it can be used for SDG monitoring and SDG 11 monitoring. Next, please. I don't know if the animation is still there or whether it's lost. Maybe it was lost. So it's basically, it was aimed to be an animation to show that Earth observation systems are continuously monitoring our Earth and producing continuously information about the Earth's surface. Also continuous information very relevant for cities and for example, the urban growth of cities, the changes from natural spaces to built-up spaces, also on many environmental indicators. And many of the SDG 11 indicators can be built on Earth observation data, or can be at least linked to Earth observation data. Next, please. So as part of the Earth observation toolkit, you have basically a lot of tools which help cities to understand, for example, the monitoring of impervious surfaces, of built-up areas, of air pollution aspects. So this is all Earth observation methods which are useful for local SDG 11 monitoring. Next, please. So this toolkit is built by a large network of contributors, so reaching from government and city level representatives, combining their needs and understanding their needs, and linking them with Earth observation experts, and developing jointly together this toolkit. We also have been many use cases as part of the toolkit for plus 30 location, which gives use reflections. Next, please. So a short overview of what are our objectives. So in principle, we see that there's a huge information need at the local level where Earth observation can play an important role. But typically, for example, urban planners don't have the sufficient capacity of using Earth observation data. And this is something we would like to bridge with the toolkit. So we want to understand the local monitoring needs. We want to increase the local partnership, the collaboration. We want to produce guided information. We want to take local stakeholders together and develop together insights on how Earth observation data can be used. And we want to become really a point of reference for the use of Earth observation data at the local level by city to city and country to country learning experiences. Next, please. So about the awareness and the role of Earth observation to measure SDG 11. Please, next. So what you see is some example of use cases on how Earth observation can be used for SDG 11 monitoring, like example. And whenever we have a use case, it's linked to a local example, like adequate housing in the context of 11.11 indicator for Mexico, 11.31 on land consumption with several examples, but also beyond SDG 11 indicators, we also have related SDG indicators, for example, 9.1, which is linked to human settlements, also like rural settlements in terms of accessibility to roads. So this all provides an understanding how Earth observation data can be relevant for SDG monitoring. Next, please. So beyond SDG, and also we have a broader vision than only SDG 11. So it's also the covering aspects of the new urban agenda, but also aspects of, in general, of urban related aspects like land cover changes, surface stability, the thermal environment, like the increasing heat and heat stress cities face, in general, environmental quality indicators. So these are all examples and use cases as part of the toolkit. Next, please. So how to use the toolkit? When you go to our website, a few snapshots, and then this will be enlightened later with more detailed and hands-on examples. So what you find in the toolkit are like guidance documents on how to use the toolkit. You also find data. So you can sort all the data according to different SDG indicators. You can sort all the tools according to the SDG indicators and also about their required pre-knowledge. And you have a large collection of use cases which can inspire you in the use of Earth observation for SDG 11 monitoring. Next, please. So as an example, a tool example, examples always comes with documentation and guidance documents on how to use the tools. Tools have a large variety, like in this case, a tool on impervious surface monitoring across years. Next, please. Another example is the global human settlement layer, which will be shown later by my colleagues from JRC. Next, please. And all the topics can be sorted by these four, all the tools and can be sorted according to the topics, which are the four main topics, which are housing. So you find specific data and tools and use cases on housing, on open space, on urbanization and public transport. Next, please. So my colleague Archie will now continue showing you some example tools which have a specific link to COVID resources. Please hand it over to you.
Thank you, Monica. So this is a nice, it's still a little bit in draft format, I want to note, but we wanted to share this as a capture or overview diagram that shows the different tools included in the toolkit and their alignment to specific missions and instruments on board those satellite missions. So that's shown in blue in terms of observational platforms. Then you can see different application areas such as COVID-19, population-related information, as well as settlements and impervious surfaces. And then the areas or categories that also pertain to specific SDG indicators. And so we include the link to the live relational diagram as well in this slide. Next one, please. We also wanted to take a moment and highlight a couple of other resources beyond our toolkit that demonstrate strong international collaboration, such as this dashboard, Earth observation dashboard on COVID-19 that was developed by 3 space agencies, the US National Aeronautics Space Agency, the European Space Agency, and the Japanese Aerospace Agency this past year, to help really combine multiple satellite data and analytical tools to share and monitor changes in air quality, water quality, economic activity, agriculture, and many other indicators. And so you can go to the link provided here and access this resource. And if we go to the next slide, please. So air quality is one of those areas that show some of the most prominent impacts of pandemic-related measures, including lockdowns or restrictions in industrial activity. And so here you see, for example, over India, we're going to look, and if you go to the next slide, we can compare the 2 images that show levels of, perhaps it didn't capture, so yes, perfect. So they show levels of nitrogen dioxide, which is an air pollutant that is well tracked using satellite data and relates to burning of fossil fuels for transportation and electricity generation. So during this past year, across the world, we did see changes in the levels of nitrogen dioxide, and we saw reduction in those levels as an impact of reduced industrial activity and also reductions in human movement and travel. However, for example, here in India, we see that this was not even across the areas. And so we can see, for example, but in the Northeast, some areas did not see changes that were consistent with US seen in other parts. And that was, for instance, a result of ongoing operations of coal-based power plants that did not reduce electric power generation during the periods of enhanced restrictions and lockdowns. Let's go to the next slide, please. Another metric or element that you can see and find in this dashboard are these mobility data that were provided by Google that help show changes in movement and movement trends across a number of categories. And so you see here both across geography. So here we have an example of what this looked like in the United States and in Italy. And so you can see here changes across a number of categories, such as movement in residential areas, to go to grocery stores, movement with relation to parks and other outdoor activities. And you can see especially those decreasing and well below the baseline trends at the beginning of the pandemic and the very strong high restrictions. And then you can also see some elements of changes, especially as restrictions are being eased, or for instance in Italy during last summer when some of these restrictions were lifted. And so these, among other components that relate, for instance, to the impact of the pandemic on the food supply chain and agriculture domain, among other areas, can be found through this dashboard. Let's go to the next slide, please. So with that, Monica and I wish to thank you very much. Would like to invite you to visit the eotoolkit.unhabitat.org portal and let us know how you find, if the information is useful there, what else you may wish to see. And also let us know if you have tools or use cases that you'd like to contribute. And if you wish to get involved, please write to us. With that, I'll invite Bob Chen, our colleague, that will now dive into some toolkit demonstrations or tool demonstrations for you. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm gonna share the slides of Robert, who's giving more examples of the use of such platform. Just a second.
Okay, great. Well, I'm pleased to participate in this. Thanks, RG and Monica. I will be talking about several tools that are available through the toolkit that were developed by the center I run, which is funded by NASA here in the US. I also, of course, participate in the EO for SDG initiative, and along with colleagues at the JRC, I co-chair another initiative NGO called the Human Planet Initiative. But have been collaborating and populating the toolkit, and look forward to getting feedback and inputs on it. Next. So if you go into the toolkit, there are some, some ways in which you can filter through and select relevant data and tools. I just filtered through the tool list to illustrate the three I'm going to talk about briefly right now, this morning, in my case. These are free interactive tools that you can use online. And their intent is to help people really visualize data that's available quickly, with the idea that presumably to dig in, you might want to download the data and for your particular region and do analysis. But the tools are getting more sophisticated. They can start to do some initial analysis that may be useful. But I think that's an evolving process. Next. So the first one I'm going to talk about, of course, is driven by COVID. Like everyone else, a year ago, there was a lot of unknowns about how COVID was spreading. I'm sure all of you were familiar and have seen the mortality or case and mortality data on COVID that was produced by Johns Hopkins University that collected the data from around the world. Now, they of course did an incredible job pulling that data and making it available quickly. They also made it available through open services. But one of the limitations that we found was it didn't really give you an idea of what the underlying exposed or vulnerable population would be when, relative to the number of cases or the number of deaths. And then, of course, there was a lot of really speculation about factors that might affect the ability of the of COVID-19 to spread, and that, of course, is still going on. There's still papers, analyses coming out about trying to model the spread and predict its further development. But from our viewpoint, we wanted to see, well, we do have some data relevant to the problem, and can we quickly put together a tool that takes advantage of that? Can we reuse some of our other tool components and put this out? So we did. We started with an initial release in April and improved it over time through September last year. Next. So when we were looking at the literature at the time, a lot of it wasn't published yet, a lot just in general discussion. Obviously, there were some age and sex differences in the spread. Clearly, older people were vulnerable. Next. And of course, the density of population and the degree of urbanization, the potential that things like public transport was a factor, was being discussed. There was a lot of interest in the public health community in whether air pollution increased death rates and other factors like temperature and altitude and so forth. So a lot of it was still, again, speculation. Next. But we did have some data available. Of course, there are these global population data sets where the data has been gridded at the subnational level. In our case, the data set we developed also has estimates of demographic characteristics, so age and sex disaggregations. Next. And we had been working with the JRC about the degree of urbanization data, which you'll hear about, I think, from in the next talk. Next. Then, of course, elevation, as I mentioned, next. And air quality, which, of course, can be assessed through satellite-based sensors. Next. So putting those together in a way that might be useful to the users was an interesting process. We discussed this with epidemiologists and others. What you'll see is that you can drill down to subnational levels. We were able to get county level data in the US, but usually second level administrative regions in most other countries. So here, for example, is a capital district in Colombia. And one of the things we were trying to get at was how do you put the data so you can look at time trends. There's a very nice, unfortunately, it's not a live demo, but there's a very nice slider you can move to get different time periods, different averaging periods and so forth for the case data and the mortality data. And then sort of this bottom half brings in the population statistics. One of the things we found in beta testing was it was important to emphasize that this was the kind of baseline population data, nothing affected by COVID, of course, because all the censuses and so forth were done before last year. And a lot of the censuses in the 2020 round were delayed. So this kind of gives a way for people to get a sense of whether the region is, has a large elderly population or has big differences in sex ratios and so forth. So next. And one of the functions, since people are interested not necessarily in just a fixed administrative area, was what is the characteristic of any arbitrary defined area. So you can draw a polygon and get an estimate of the things like the degree of urbanization and the age structure and population for that specific area. Next. We're tight on time. So that's kind of the quick overview of the COVID viewer. That at the end, there'll be some links where you can play around with it yourself. And we're looking at ways of improving it. So we certainly welcome input. Another tool, no, sorry, go back, is the PopGrid Viewer. This is another tool that allows you to dig in and look at different gridded population data sets, not just the one that my center produces, but one we produce jointly with the Joint Research Center, commercial product from Esri, and a product from Facebook that we helped develop, but also other sources. So now you can go to the next one. One of the things in the science community is we've developed many different models of how to estimate population regionally in both urban and rural areas. And they actually differ quite a bit. They use different inputs. Some use quite sophisticated remote sensing inputs, and others are very simple for various reasons. So that's great from a science viewpoint, but from people working in the field, it gets confusing. And so we developed the PopGrid Viewer next as a way of helping people sort of understand what the differences might be and how that might affect their analysis. So for example, we've been using different data sets to estimate one of the SDG indicators, the proportion of rural population living within 2 kilometers of an all-season road. And what you find is, depending on the data set, you can get rather large differences in the estimates of population according to the indicator. Now, the percentage tends to be more stable, but the absolute numbers can vary quite a bit for the countries you see. So some of that's documented in a story map that's available through the SDGs Today site. Next. And because of that complication, we've been working with the Sustainable Development Solution Network, a subgroup called Thematic Research Network on Data and Statistics, which I also co-chair, to develop this resource called the PopGrid Data Collaborative website. And just briefly, it contains the background information on all the different data sets that I showed in a previous chart, and then some comparison tables and the tool that I started to show you next. And that tool has this nice 4-panel things. So instead of having data overlaid like most map clients, and you can't see the bottom layers unless you fiddle with the transparency and stuff. This is a 4-panel that lets you look simultaneously at 4 data sets at a time, move around, zoom in, and they all go simultaneously. It makes it a lot easier to compare data. And not only that, next you can do that little polygon thing that I showed for the COVID viewer. You can do that on any area that's Cape Town. And then it'll tell you, well, that all the different data sets have these different estimates. That's actually several points in time, but these different estimates for exactly that polygon. So you can see there's quite a bit of variation in the number of people who are estimated to live in the coastal areas of Cape Town, as an example. Next. And then finally, there's a tool that's mentioned, which is, I won't go into, but also looks at the impervious surface issue, which is certainly important for urban areas. It uses that same 4-panel model, but showing quality data as well as the data itself. Next. So, and click once more. So again, that's just a quick look at a few of the tools. You know, hope they're interesting and useful. The sources there are the references to the papers that I mentioned related to the COVID-19 viewer. But we're interested in feedback and hope that these data and the other tools are useful to people. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And I thank also the experts that are now replying to the questions that are coming up in the question and answer sessions. There's quite a debate going on. Okay, while the debate goes on, then I invite Thomas Kemper from the GHSL team at the European Commission JRC to provide us a perspective on how to compute urbanization statistics from freely available data and tools on the web, so that we can finally define what a city is and how to monitor SDGs at the local level within cities. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I was muted, and I also have a camera. I hope you can see me now. Thank you for this introduction, and it's very nice to talk after the colleagues that have prepared the floor already. The data that I'm going to present are also part of the Earth Observation Toolkit. So if you are becoming interested, as some of the people in the chat mentioned, then check out the Earth Observation Toolkit, where you find more details, or directly go to our website. In my presentation, I would like to draw on this degree of urbanization that was mentioned already a bit earlier, because it seems to be a quite specific problem, but you will see that this has wide implications all over the SDG reporting, also even at the local level. So go to the next slide, please. The situation currently is that basically each country is deciding what the city is, what's the size of the city, where the city stops. And on the left-hand side of my slide, you see in the different colors the different types of definitions that the countries report to the UN. And we don't have to go into much detail there, but you see quite some variation. And most interestingly, if you look at the dark blue ones, those are countries that have not a statistically defined definition of cities. So they may have some administrative or even legal laws that decide that a certain settlement is a city or not. And this is, of course, creating problems if you want to compare different cities and cities between countries. Moreover, it's also complicating the comparison of the SDG statistics at a global level. Because if one country has cities that are at least 100,000 inhabitants, and another country has cities already starting with 10,000, then of course the statistics will be very different. And there are a number of SDGs that require either urban or rural population information. This is, if you go to the next slide, please. This is where then the European Commission was teaming up with other international stakeholders, FAO, the International Labour Organization, OECD, UN Habitat, and the World Bank, to come up with a harmonized definition that allows a comparison within countries, but also between countries, to facilitate then also the process of the SDG reporting. And this process was launched in 2016 at the Habitat 3 conference. And last March, so March 2020, it was adopted by the UN Statistical Commission for international comparison. So this new definition is not supposed to cancel any national definition. This can go on, but if countries are reporting to the UN, they're invited to use this international established harmonized definition. And this definition was based on data produced by our team, the Global Human Settlement layer. And there we will show also later the tools that we are providing that allows countries to implement that. But let's go quickly to this definition. The next slide, please. I will not go into much detail, but just give you the highlights of this definition. It's a people-based definition, so it relies on population density. You see here an example for Cork in Ireland, where the different colors represent different densities, with the lighter colors being less dense than the red colors in the center. If you click once to the next slide, you see then the classification based on density thresholds and neighboring relations. We clearly can identify now the urban center of Cork surrounded by some urban clusters, so less dense suburbs or peri-urban areas, and also some independent towns in the outskirts against a rural population background. And if you go to the next slide, one click more, yes, thank you. Then you can see that it is then possible also to classify the administrative local units to understand whether a local unit is an urban unit or a rural unit. And this sounds trivial if you are in the local context, but for example, we are currently working with Kenya, who is applying our method in order to redefine the urban extent of their administrative system, because population growth and urbanization growth was such that they really lost track of all the changes in the country, and they are happy to have now a harmonized way where they can use their local census information to apply the degree of urbanization. In the next presentation by my colleague, he will go much more into detail. But next slide, please, Pietro. If we apply now this global definition to global data like our global human settlement layer, we see very, very interesting things. First place, if you start from the right-hand side, we see that the world is much more urban according to this definition than what is presented by the UN. So instead of 56%, we come up with 75%. And you see there this yellow bar in the orange that represents what is reported by the UN for certain areas. So if then you start from the left-hand side of this graph with the African context and Asia, you see that this yellow bar is mostly very close to the red area. So this represents mostly the city parts, while moving then to North America and Northern Europe, it's moving higher up towards the towns and suburbs that are included. So we see here quite a difference that on the one hand, some continents refer to urban mostly as the dense city part, while others include also the towns and suburbs. And this explains this difference between the UN figures, the national figures, and this new definition. But let's see now what we can do with this definition. If you go to the next slide, we can now really look and compare countries by the degree of urbanization. So in this graph, we're showing the share of households having access to electricity by degree of urbanization for a number of countries. And for each of the countries, we have plotted the access to electricity by towns and suburbs, by cities, and by rural areas. And we can see now a very clear trend that except for some cases that also might have some outliers there, we always see that access to electricity in cities is highest in all the countries. And it's followed by towns and suburbs, and in most of the cases, the rural areas are left still to quite some extent without electricity access. So very, very clear information just by adding this component of the different classes of urbanization. Another example on the next slide. This one is looking at the access to mobile phones. And also there you can see quite a gradient. We have now here a grouping between income classes. On the left-hand side, the low income countries, on the right-hand side, the high income countries. And we see a clear gradient from low income to high income countries with an increase in the availability of mobile phones. But then you can also see the differences within those groups. For example, looking at the low income countries where 50% of the rural population has already a mobile phone, but 75 have it also in urban areas. So quite a strong gradient here. Next slide. One more example, the land use efficiency. So with this definition, we are able to outline the extent of all the cities. And with the availability of open time series of satellite data, we can also go back and can analyze the land use efficiency, which looks at the population growth compared to the settlement growth as a whole, to see if there's urban sprawl, or if there's a densification in the urban areas and overpopulation. And we can then look into the different pattern of urbanization according to the indicator 1131. This is just a few examples on how this global definition can help you then also at the local level to do some SDG reporting. And the next presentation, my colleague Michele will show how to do it. But please go to the last slide. Just some quick feedback from countries that we are talking to regarding this degree of urbanization. Mostly they mention that it captures the majority of areas formerly identified as urban. It uses a practical metrics and presents an easy to adapt approach because it's people-based. It's quite easy to understand and to follow. And it provides a scientific way of delineating cities and an opportunity for harmonization of urban statistics. And I think with that, I will stop and hand over to Pietro and my colleague Michele.
Yes, thanks. So Michele will now illustrate the details of this degree of urbanization methodology. Michele, please go ahead.
Thank you, Pietro, and also Thomas for setting the scene on the degree of urbanization. And also a special thanks to UNITAR for convening such an inspiring learning session. In this presentation, I have the pleasure to illustrate the role of the Global Human Settlement Layer team at GRC in supporting the degree of urbanization uptake with data, tools, and capacity building activities, and where you can access all this information. Next slide, please. The degree of urbanization, as it's been mentioned before, is a method to classify the entire territory of a country or of a region into cities, towns, suburbs, and rural areas. And it is supported by 6 international organizations, as Thomas presented before. And the primary aim of this partnership was to equip statisticians and researchers with methods to compare urban and rural related statistics across countries. Earlier in this year, at the request of the United Nations Statistical Commission, Eurostat, which is the statistical office of the EU, has led the preparation of a methodological manual on how to apply the degree urbanization method to define cities and rural areas for international comparison. The manual explains the method, but also presents the tools that can be used to apply the methodology. Next slide, please. In parallel to the methodology, JRC also produced a method, a technical report on Colombia to explain in details how this can be applied to national housing and population census. The degree urbanization is applied in a three-step approach, and it's based on population size and density. So the primary ingredient is a population grid, which is basically a subdivision of the territory into small grid cells. It's basically a geospatial concept. Those grid cells are equal size and squared of 1 kilometer, for example, and this allows to remove the distortion in population density. And each grid cells estimate the amount of people that that could be located there. Using this population grid, the second step is based on a set of simple rules to define the different settlement typologies based on a settlement classification grid. And this is done via a logic of population size and density and grid cells contiguity. And then in step 3, using data from the 2 previous steps, local units, for example, administrative or census units, are classified into city, town and suburbs, and rural areas based on population majority rules. These steps can be implemented with GHSL tools that I'm explaining to you later on. Next slide, please. So since 2016, the Global Human Settlement Layer produces a global data set, open data, going back in time from 1975 to 2015 in different products. First, we produce a global mosaic of satellite imagery, or we use existing collection like the one from Landsat, or more recently the one from Sentinel-2 Copernicus constellation. And from those images, we apply some machine learning technologies and algorithms to produce a built-up area map. And this map is used to disaggregate population coming from census. For example, the CESIN GPW gridded population of the world 4.1 or 0.11 into the built-up areas. This way, we have localized the population from a larger administrative unit to built-up areas only. And afterwards, we basically classify settlement typologies based on the logic of population density and size, as explained before. This transition shows the example of Bangkok in Thailand, from the image from Landsat to the settlement classification on the extreme right. Next slide, please. There are 3 core datasets in the GHSL framework: the GHS built-up area, GHS population grid, and GHS SMOD, which is the settlement classification. But also, we provide additional analytical global datasets, like the Urban Center database, that is a multi-dimensional database of cities with indicators useful to characterize city by environmental, disaster risk reduction characteristics, like exposed population to floods or to anthropogenic emission, or to estimate SDG like 1131. Next slide, please. In addition to data, in case, let's say, partners have their own census data or built-up areas, we also offer open and free tools to apply the degree urbanization. All of them, all of the tools, there are more than 10 by now, are freely available on the GHSL website and do come with detailed documentation. There are three main tools that are used in Cascade to apply the degree urbanization. Basically, one to produce the population grid, another one for the settlement classification grid, and the third one to classify local units. And I'm now going to present each of them. Next slide, please. The first tool of the family is the GHS POP2G, which is used to produce the population grid using built-up area and geospatial census data as input. The tool outputs the population grid at several spatial resolution, ranging from 50 meters to 1 kilometer in the grid cell size. And all of the GHSL tools are available as a standalone version using a MATLAB runtime, which is also freely available from the web, or they can be used as ArcGIS toolbox if the user is more capable with geospatial information systems. Next slide, please. Afterwards, so after the production of the population grid, the user can produce a settlement classification grid using the GHS DUG tool, the grid urbanization grid, which produce a settlement classification grid. And it requires just the built-up areas that were used already in the previous step and the population grid that was produced with the POP2G tool right before. The DUG outputs the settlement grid that we see here with the different colors, and also Thomas shown in his slides, but also vector files with the list of cities and, for example, built-up areas or population for these entities. Next slide, please. The step 3 of the degree urbanization is completed with the GHS DU TAC tool, which is a degree urbanization territorial unit classifiers. And this tool uses the previous outputs, so the population grid and the settlement classification grid, plus some administrative units that are provided by the user to classify them into cities, town and suburbs, and rural areas. This step is actually fundamental for linking existing statistics that are collected within those administrative units to link them to urban and rural classification. Because by joining the tables, it's possible to disaggregate, for example, employment or access to electricity, as Thomas showed before, by degree urbanization, so for cities, town and suburbs, and rural areas. Now I'm going to just touch base on the next slide on where all this information can be accessed. The GHSL has a fairly big website that can be accessed at ghsl.grc.ec europa.eu, which is the entry point to all the sources and resources of the GHSL project. Next slide. First, we had seen data. Those can be freely downloaded from the Data and Tools panel, clicking Download Data. And this page allows you to select which of the products from the column on the left side of the screen, where you can see the different products that I briefly mentioned, plus some others. You can choose a desired epoch, for example, 1975 or 2015 at your choice, and the resolution, so the size of the grid cells, and for some products, also the coordinate systems. Once you identified your required product, you can download the global one or some specific areas of the globe, like shown in the picture. In the next slide, I'm showing you the tools section of the website, where you can find all the tools presented before and the other one related to spatial analytics or remote sensing image processing. Each of the tools comes in a small section with the documentation and the download file. In the next slide, I'm just focusing a bit on the user guides, because a lot of our work also goes into the documentation. And this is very detailed because it provides guidance for installation, operation, and also troubleshooting. Especially national statistical offices are the beneficiaries of those products. But in the next slide, I'm also showing that we are enlarging our capacity building from online resources, so the tools downloads, the methodologies, and the tools download pages, into an online training program, which Pietro is leading the development of, with a modular structure, with video tutorials and demos. This is forthcoming, but we are already in touch with several statistical offices for custom support for the application of the degree of urbanization. So this concludes my presentation. And if you have any questions, just follow up in the chat or feel free to write us a message. Thank you.
Thanks, Michele, for providing all the details of our tools offer. And now we will shift from the technical perspective of geographers and Earth observations and technology and all the things to a more policy focused perspective. And the city of Espoo will now illustrate how the local administration there will achieve many SDGs and which is the roadmap and recipe to towards such goal. So I invite Markku Markkula to take over the floor, and I share his presentation. Markku.
Okay, thank you all, and great to be here and sharing the experiences and learning new things from the other presentations as well. So I will first introduce briefly the city of Espoo and our, let's say, our approach to the SDGs and the climate issue especially, and then Dr. Ville Tajama will explain about the tool, the instrument that we have developed for the use of us and for the use of others. So, but let me start with this slide by stressing that we've seen clearly that we need to increase the ambition level, but as well we've seen that climate and SDG targets can be achieved at the work by the work at the local level. So local and regional authorities, they are responsible for 70% of the climate mitigation measures. So we, within the whole European Union, we see clearly that the work towards SDG targets, it needs to be more really on the local level. And that's why myself, as well as the former president of the European Committee of the Region, I stress heavily on one hand the collaboration with the Joint Research Center and other key resources, scientific knowledge, but then as well so that we need all at the local and regional level, we need to be ready to implement the results and move to action. So with this slide, so I want to stress as well, so that inside Finland as a case, so all the 6 cities, 6 largest, biggest cities, we collaborate already regularly using our urban development financing, and as well we share a lot, and the target of this collaboration is to tackle the same challenges, find new solutions, integrate more and more private industry, large and small companies to operate with the cities and get citizens' engagement as a key role to play. We here on this first slide, we just highlight that these 6 largest cities in Finland, we've spent about 100 million euros during the 7-year program period of the EU, and more collaborating with other cities in Europe. So it's much European partnerships. Here we as well, we highlight the voluntary local review report with a link to that. So we delivered a year ago to the UN, being one of the first cities to concretely applying all these practices to the real life practice and showing the results for the others as well. So learning is the key. If we move to the next slide, So this second slide that just shown that there's a lot of statistics. We are, of course, Finland very proud that we came #1 in the recently published Sustainable Development Report. But these reports as well, they give a lot of lessons to learn, benchmark with the other countries or other cities. But then as well, benchmarking is not enough. We need to learn. We need to move to bench learning. And even we could use the new word bench acting. So action is the target. If we take the next slide, so that tries to summarize a bit. So kind of our recent years, how we, the city, have in the city of Espoo, my city, we have moved from one of those, let's say, normal cities to be one of the clearly targeted sustainable cities. 7 years ago, 8 years ago, we established by the decision of a city council a specific policy program with 5 key policy makers from the council and 5 key civil servants from the city to be in the special sustainable city program, a city sustainable Espoo program, and we moved step by step, defining the targets by the city council, giving reports to the city council, and moving now as what we've agreed to be carbon neutral by 2030 and to implement all the SDGs already by 2035. If we take the next slide, that shows on as well some actions, especially focusing on the climate, and that shows on as well, so that we, the city of 300,000 inhabitants, we are part of the metropolitan region in Finland. Our advantage as a city, but other cities and towns in Finland, that we have historically developed on the 50s and 60s a district heating system. And now we can change instead of using coal, we can move to renewables. And we have a clear commitment with our local industries, how we are going to do that in the next years to come. Many parallel activities make that a reality. And if I take then, or you take the next slide, so that's the last slide, and click once more. So there we show that it's on operations on a regional basis as well. The figure on the right hand, so that's the smart specialization strategy of the Helsinki region. We are part of that, so our 3 priorities are climate neutrality, citizen engagement, what is the citizen-driven city, and the renewing, modernizing our industries. And then on the left side, there are a few concrete instruments and measures that are implemented by the EU or given as instruments, including financing for the cities to move on. And that's what we do at the city level. And now Dr. Tajama will show on how we take this systematic approach to implementing SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Markku. And yes, now we move to the next presenter who will show us the details on how to monitor SDGs at the city level and include them in the municipal policy agenda, which is very interesting. So, Ville, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pietro, and thank you, Markku, our chair for the city board of Espoo, has an extremely long experience in sustainable development and creating policies for cities. I'd like 2 things to start with. I think Alessandra said wonderful things in the introduction. I will come back to that in just a second. Now, looking at this session, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us. You know, we've been down up there, we've been there up into space, looking at from satellites. We've been looking at grids and urban areas, and we've been looking at cities as objectives. They're like something we observe from the space. I think what Markku and I are talking about is really looking cities as subjects, as something like perhaps even persons. So it's a hopefully for all of us here in this session would be a fruitful addition. I think for the to just give some numbers for that Alessandra was talking about, and Mark also mentioned. So 70% of all the greenhouse gases, 80% of all food consumption, 50% of global waste are produced in cities and by citizens. So that's a number. OECD estimates that 65% of all the SDG targets and indicators will be solved in cities. So for every 3 SDG, 2 of them are solved in and by cities. Meaning that if we are the cause for many of the grand challenges and ecological, social, economical challenges, we need to be the solutions as well. And I'm sure this goes for many cities on this planet, that the Agenda 2030 is an excellent fit for this. So it's for us, it's really a kind of it's a framework. It's a metrics. It can be that's what we're talking mostly about today. How does it work as a metric? And it's also vocabulary. It's becoming a lingua franca for cities to communicate within, between, and outside the cities. So kind of as an introductory argument, I will say that the battle against climate change or biodiversity loss and the war against social inequalities are fought and won in cities. Okay, so but however, for a city official perspective that I'm taking here, the big question is, how do you turn global, national, or even multinational level goals, targets, and indicators into urban setting, so that they truly serve the local, regional, national, and international sustainability that is implemented by the cities. Next, please. You know, for Espoo and I'd say for a rapidly growing number of other cities, the first pragmatic step on this journey is to conduct a voluntary local review, a VLR that Mr. Markkula already touched upon. That's where you review and report your progress on SDGs on city level. Next, please. So we did our voluntary local review in a very participatory way, and already with a clear focus on our strategy, the Espoo story. And that did give us excellent insight about where we are. The thing is that it's one thing, and it's an important thing to know where you are. It's a different thing to understand where you need to be. And most importantly, perhaps, how you're going to get there. So next, we will not emphasize to the VLR process. We will look into what happens after that. Next, please. So kind of like previously mentioned, and all the above mentioned means that in addition to achieving the SDGs, as mentioned locally, cities have a regional, national, and international role to play in creating not only kind of like achieving the SDGs per se, but creating solutions for the future challenges as well. So that's how we define creating handprint. So you're catalyzing positive change. And those, of course, who have more capacity need to play a more responsible role to be a forerunner. Key idea being that it's really not enough to solve the SDGs. They are a great framework, great metrics, but there will be new challenges arising. I think the whole theme of this year's HLPF is an example of that. But so now we know what we should do. The final question, how, still remains. So in order for us to achieve the SDGs and create those solutions, the only possible way is to do it together. And as a city official, I'm talking about the organization, So how to commit the whole organization, but it's also about how to do it with other cities. For example, the 6 largest cities in Finland, with our partners, with national states, with companies, with the citizens. And I trust all this is very linear and logical to you. The problem, however, is that I would argue that less than 10% of these highly skilled, highly trained, highly motivated people that work in these companies, cities, ministries, and other places really know what the SDGs are and really work with them. And I'm talking about very highly skilled people. So how do you implement something? How do you create new solutions when people do not know what the SDGs are or what they mean for their work? This is, I'd say that a reality that we work with daily basis. Next, please. So for us to move forward, there has to be a sense-making process. I saw there was some discussion about this in the Q&A as well, and I hope this answers that question partly. That has kind of like has relevance to a city and its partners at all levels, like the strategic level, tactical and operative. It has to be holistic, but just as Alessandra said in the introduction, it has to be simple enough. It's not constructive if you're really fast, if no one else is following. You have to take this adventure together. So your organization and your partners have to be with you. So basically what we need is a tool. And that's the simple reason behind all this process, to make sense what the SDGs mean to my work, to my team, to my unit, my department, to my city. Next, please. Brief look at the kind of like the overlook about the tool. It's a facilitated workshop process. It takes about 3 to 5 hours time to go through. It works best when you have identified a phenomenon, project or work role that we can work with. It looks into different dimensions of sustainability. It looks into operational environment you're in. It looks into your strategy, your network, and your localized indicators. It's a strategic tool, for it provides the city leadership with an idea and data what is happening within the city from the perspective of SDGs. It's a tactical tool, for it creates knowledge and understanding for those who are engaged in actually implementing the strategy. And it's an operative tool for those who are in the trenches working with the SDGs, there where the rubber meets the road in an urban context. Next, please. So, brief look. I won't exhaust you, don't worry. We will just look at 3 from the 7 steps that I think are quite key for understanding this. And the first one is obviously that we have defined the phenomena or the theme or the project that we work with, and then we select the first SDG. And that's already a convergent phase. So you need to make a selection, a pretty tough one actually. But this enhances, catalyzes learning as well. And you get to choose 2 to 4 supportive SDGs. And that's the first step. But then next, please. Then I'll skip a few steps and I'll go to step 3, which is, let's say, one of the, there's just 2 remaining. This is one of the key phases because this looks at the sustainability from a holistic perspective. And it follows the preamble and the SDGs nicely. And it's an all-entailing and kind of like a systems approach to sustainable development. One of the main challenges, or at least that we face, is that the bulk of the people we work with still consider sustainable development to be just ecological sustainability, as important as it is, as we know. But here they need to cover all dimensions in the context of their work. And in addition, think about the operational environment. Next. Thank you, Pietro. And have to admit, this is my favorite. So whether your number one philosopher is Hegel, Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle, this phase follows a process of pretty close to dialectic approach. I mean, it's not dialectic per se, but if you know the thinking behind the thesis, the antithesis, and synthesis, it will help you to understand this very important phase nicely. So first, we spent about 20 to 30 minutes just learning the targets and indicators of your main SDG. And you know, from the feedback from the trials and pilots that we have made, this is already a good learning experience. Then and I'm not saying this is an antithesis, but the second phase is that you look at your works, the main objectives of your work. I mean, typically it can be like a scoreboard level objective or a project plan objective, but typically it's written in a different way. And now you create the first link between the SDG target and indicators and with your own objectives. You write them in the two boxes. But then kind of the main learning comes from the third phase, which is the synthesis in this case, where you rewrite your objectives in a way that uses the SDG vocabulary. So you create and there's a dialogue already there between the objectives and the targets, because we let them influence. You might realize that, oh, I actually didn't take this into consideration at all, and then you rewrite the new indicators that are truly connected to your work objectives. And I can't emphasize enough how important this is, because let's say that you want to achieve the SDGs at a certain year. But I mean, what does that really mean at the implementation level? You have to have indicators that you follow that actually then make it concrete, kind of that promise. So this is and it has to be done together with the people who are actually implementing it. I think, you know, just I won't exhaust you with the other steps. We love to work together with you. I'll just share with you that we have now piloted this process several times. 6 largest cities that Mr. Markkula was already mentioning about, together with an organization that represent actually all the municipalities in Finland, are committed to use this process. We just got funding from the Ministry of Economics and Employment for the next 2.5 years to develop this further. It's been developed already together with both Finnish cities and Finnish cities from abroad with tens of people. I thank you all sincerely. It follows a Linux philosophy, so it's open data, use it. Use one question or use the whole process. We of course hope that you would connect us and we could develop it further and create the future together. Final slide, please. To end, we talked about Hegel and other philosophers. I will, however, end with the words of famous contemporary philosopher, Mr. Elvis Presley, whose words reflect the SDGs quite well, I think. Little less conversation, little more action.
Thanks, Bill. This is, I think, a very nice conclusion for for your presentation. Very practical and yeah, concrete experience that you bring from Finland. Okay, I think I went I lost the connection a second, but I'm still here. So yeah, I was about to introduce the last presenters from the Nova Green Lab, Low Green Lab in Portugal. And now I'm sharing their slides here. There you go, Nevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pietro. Good afternoon, everybody from Lisbon. We're having a really wonderful time today. So I hope that you have also enjoyed the session. We're very thankful to UNITAR for having selected us as one of the institutions to join in this knowledge sharing panel. And I'm also very thankful to the other representatives of the institutions for the work that they have done to put all of this together and our fruitful collaboration. So just very quickly, my name is Nevina Lia and I'm from the Nova Law Green Lab. We are a research center within the Nova School of Law based in Lisbon with a series of researchers with very different profiles, but in common the interest for sustainable development. I will be the first one to start this session talking about governance. I believe that we have had a lot of information today from data. We've had the experience that Ville has shared from a hands-on city perspective. And then I think that take into consideration the pandemic, it is very important that we use this time to get lessons from this very unexpected happening that we had and to go further on in pursuing our goals for achieving climate neutrality very soon. So we can go to the next slide. I will be very brief in my presentation. We will have several more colleagues to join. And I think that what we've heard from now from the city of Espoo, how they implement politics and their governance means to pursue the SDGs. And it is very important that now these urban representations of land and communities build more than just sustainability, but build resilience following the pandemic. So to get these lessons learned, I can think that we have seen several elements that happen. And one of them, if we talk about an interdependence between the urban and the rural areas, we saw that there was a sort of a feature of the crisis that depended on the food security. And then for rural areas, they depended on cities for access to basic health and amenities. And building on this regional and local coordination to have stronger ties between them and have a resilient rural and urban interdependence would ensure that then we can have a safe delivery of services between them and not having a fragmentation in urban planning that we are seeing would also further help us in achieving sustainability and resilience. Another element that we can see is that we have to put focus on what is otherwise known as decentralized governance. So we see that the citizen itself closer to the communities and closer to the citizens, having them empowered for faster action and faster responses to crisis would make them more resilient, and we would have to then recover quickly from situations that are so unprecedented as the one that we are living. Another element that we can focus on is the fact that there is traditional and rigid sectoral approaches that can be changed using data, as we've seen particularly today. If we establish systems and processes for emergency responses that are scientifically based in information mapping analysis of the different sectors, then it would mean that we would be responding with smart technologies in real time to crisis. And I saw in our chat, we had a question about the communities and how citizen participation is really important in building resilience in urban areas. And I would have to say that that when we talk about collaboration amongst the different levels of governance, so and the interested parties, so government, private sector, civil society, and different other stakeholders, then we have to make this the new norm, and this has to be initiated. So we have built a bridge between these different actors, and also we are encouraging to fight the different capacity constraints that stakeholders might have. But it is very important that we have a participatory community, so the smaller level, the closer to the grassroots our activities are, the better it is. When we talk about independence of these urban representations, we have to think also about the fact that they might not be fiscally independent from the governments, and that way we have to strengthen their fiscal autonomy, also for sustainable delivery of essential services. So making them not only independent fiscally, but also expecting from them a delivery of functions that are a combination of different deriving from taxations, intergovernmental charges, and the sorts that provide city services, making all of these local bodies able to improve their efficiency and to promote transparency and accountability, especially in the way they are doing their daily activities. I believe it would be really helpful to build on their sustainability and resilience. So I will, we have seen that being prepared in the cities and the response and the recovery at the moment seem to be quite slow, but we can build on this experience. So for future happenings, if it is pandemics or other crises, then we have built a robust governance system, and the conventional approaches that we are using thus far, I believe, are not the ones that will help us in the future. So we really have to do a bottom-up sort of revolution for all of these measures, and we have to apply the examples of the best practices that we see some of them today. Lastly, can I have the last slide, Pietro? Yeah. So this is a view of our beautiful, just a last.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
So just to thank you for your attention, I will pass the word to my colleague, Tiago Cartacho, and this is a picture of Lisbon, and hopefully in future events, we will welcome you here.
Yes. Thanks, Nevin. So the next presenter is now coming over.
Thank you very much, Pietro. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Let me first of all say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are at the moment all over the world. Let me also first thank you for having us.
Wait.
In this.
Now we're having a little bit of echo, or maybe I don't know if it's okay. Now it's better.
Okay. Thank you to Unitar for having us in this excellent session. It is an honor to be with you here today. We can go to the next slide. Here, our idea was to give you to go a bit forward after Nevin's introduction. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, on cities, well, everyone's talked about cities today, so I won't spend much time explaining more, but obviously we understand cities as complex and dynamic systems. They're unstable, they're uncertain. Obviously that climate change has been even increasing these vulnerabilities, inequality, and the reality is that the pandemic has increased even more all these vulnerabilities. And that's why we would like to detail a little bit what we've introduced to you before. We could go to the next slide, please, which is the idea that law can be a tool for, but can also be an obstacle to both resilience and even justice in cities. If we have a crystallizing or a crystallized system, obviously it can't be a tool. So we have been working with other colleagues from other universities, especially from the University of Louisville, Professor Tony on these ideas and these solutions of adaptive law. The big question is to understand if your legals and regulation systems are adaptive or maladaptive. Adaptive law could be seen
Can you remove
as...
headphone? Your audio is really shaky.
Is it shaky?
Yeah, it's
okay. To take the headphones out. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's better.
Okay, thank you. It is in fact a set of conceptual tools and characteristics that can facilitate the adaptation of different systems, and obviously cities are understood as complex social, ecological, and institutional systems, and obviously they suffer disturbances. This would be a new resilience-based paradigm, and if we look at the next slide, we could compare the characteristics or the different characteristics of a maladaptive legal system and adaptive legal systems. Really quick, not to take much of your time, maladaptive legal systems would be would be systems where systematic goals would be narrow, with monocentric structures. They're unimodal, they're fragmented, they have inflexible methods to employ rules and legal abstractions and resist to change. And they're rational, linear, legal centralists. They have legal centralist processes and obviously assume away uncertainty. If we look at more adaptive legal systems, we don't have much time to explain, but here are some of the correct characteristics. They have a multiplicity of articulated goals. They are polycentric, they are multimodal, they have an integrationist structure. They have adaptive methods based on standards, flexibility, discretion, obviously always trying to keep the certainty using this discretion and the flexibility, and they are a legal pluralist. So they must have adaptive goals, they must have an adaptive structure, they must have adaptive methods and adaptive processes. Really quickly, we could say that for the last year and a half, we have been facing experiences from all over the world where public policy, regulations, and laws have been modified in an extremely fast way, exactly to adapt legal and policy systems to the COVID-19 pandemic reality. Governments are changing policies and regulation each week, and sometimes each day, to better face these vulnerable realities. However, if we look at examples such as the Portuguese reality and more specifically the Lisbon metropolitan area at the moment, we can see law, regulation, and decision-making that is imposing lockdown rules and certain restrictions to citizens' movements or behaviors from a top-down perspective. This is very often imposed by national governments, even when it concerns a region or a municipality. This means that very often decisions are still monocentric, centralized, even if they have some characteristics of flexibility, as they may change from a week to another. As a conclusion, we can look at the last slide. As a conclusion, we could say that the pandemic has been testing the adaptive capacity of national, regional, and local governments and their policy and legal systems. However, there still is a large room for advances in more polycentric and integrated decision and regulation making, with more participation, more attention to feedback loops, learning and accountability, and the use of real-time data, as Naveen said, is in this point a paramount solution, even for law and regulation, which usually are understood as realities that struggle to follow the rapid changes in social ecological systems. Maíra and Cristiana will therefore explain specific case studies in more detailed way then. Again, thank you so much for this opportunity to share our work with you. Have an excellent day or evening.
Thank you, Tiago. And then we move to Maíra and look closer to the example of Brazil.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. And I will speak today about this federative conflict that took place in Brazil during the year 2020 concerning the policies to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a work, I am a researcher at the Nova Law Green Lab as well, but this is also a research that I am doing for the Global Pandemic Network, and Cristiana will talk a little bit about the network after me. And I will share with you an overview of this conflict, and I believe there are lessons to be learned from this conflict, and maybe they can be applied not only, but specifically to large countries that are a federation and a multi-level federation as Brazil. So please, next slide. First, I will walk you through the timeline of milestone events that happened in 2020. And the next slide, please. I will give you a few seconds to read. And the point of these milestone events is that Brazil is a democratic presidentialist country. And there are legal instruments that can be enacted by the Congress, but also legal instruments that can be enacted by the president itself. And by enacting this instrument called Provisional Measure 926 in 2020, the President Bolsonaro in Brazil tried to withhold in the federal level of a Brazilian administration all the actions to fight and contain the COVID-19 pandemic. The law that has been enacted by the Congress only established response actions concerning the health system. So the policies of the health system when diagnosing and when treating people with COVID-19 were established at the federal level, but all the other measures as lockdowns and prohibition of large events, closure of schools and cinemas, and sometimes even the businesses, they tried to withhold this jurisdiction only at the federal level. And what happened next was that a bottom-up process began in March 12 to April 6, and all the 26 states and all the 26 state capitals and also many more municipalities. Brazil has 5,570 municipalities. They started issuing their own policies and legislation to contain the spread of coronavirus. And these policies, they affected citizens' mobility because there were a prohibition of large events and closure of schools, and there was also a curfew at night and these sort of measures. And they clashed with the federal intention to remain to live under their own jurisdictions, this kind of measures. So there were many actions filed at the Brazilian Constitutional Court, but the main action is the one that is mentioned last in the slide on March 23. This action has a erga omnes effect, which means that after this decision, this issue could not be brought again before the courts, and it determined and acknowledged the local and regional jurisdiction over the response measures. So from this day on, all these legislation and policies established by the states and the municipalities in Brazil, they were considered valid, they were considered enforceable, and therefore the intention of the central government to keep under their jurisdiction the measures was completely overruled by the Constitutional Court. Next slide. So what are the consequences of this major action proposed at the Constitutional Court in Brazil? Next slide, please. There has been a shift in power balance within the Brazilian Federation, because first, in this major health crisis or any other kind of natural crisis in Brazil, the central government played a significant role. played a leading role, and now from the decision AD 6341, they have to share this power, and actually there has been more power shifted to the other levels of the administration, the regional and the local levels. This was a major decision from the Supreme Court because this court has always acted in the federative balance in Brazil, but before this decision, there hasn't been any other that affected all the municipalities and all the regional governments. And as I mentioned, there's the erga omnes effect. So it's been settled now that local and regional governments in Brazil have the jurisdiction over the measures to respond to the pandemic. Next slide. So a few conclusions and lessons learned from this process. This federative conflict showed that the national government lack of response left a power gap in Brazil, and that was fueled by the regional and local governments. So it could happen in other federations, and it shows that cities and regional governments are acting, as our colleague said before. Previously, there has been a strong action, a bottom-up process, and it happened because of the lack of response from the central government. So states and municipalities play a relevant role in the health crisis and other sorts of crises. However, the effectiveness of their measures is also undermined by the lack of central government cooperation. Because Brazil is such a large area state, there are some logistics and some commerce issues that could only be sorted with the support of the national government. For example, we experienced problems with supplies in the hospitals, equipment supplies, oxygen supplies, and that's because the federal government wasn't supporting the states and municipalities in some of the policies. And last slide, please. I would just like to leave this quote because I think it represents these new theories that maybe the era of the nation state is coming to an end, and who knows, there could be a new era for the city state, the old city state, but in a totally different framework. And I believe this process that took place in Brazil is a symptom of that theory, because it was a bottom-up process, because it puts the local governments in the center of a very large and massive policies against this major crisis. So, of course, this research is not enough to say that it will happen or it will not happen, but at least we can say it is a symptom that the cities are playing definitely a central role in this COVID-19 crisis worldwide. Okay, so next slide. I just like to thank you all for having us today. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them on the Q&A box or ask me directly on my email or website. And now, Cristiana.
Thank you.
Hi.
Cristiana, go ahead. Yes.
Yes, I'll go very quickly through my presentation. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this very interesting event and for the rich and insightful presentations. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Global Pandemic Network to bring an experience that originated in the academia, but is now a meeting point for institutions at global level. Next, please. The GPN is a community of scholars from universities around the world, an international network in the field of human sciences aimed at bringing together academics and experts with a view to mutually exchange research, information on pandemics, engage in deep-root discussion, and bring forward solutions for decision makers based on the analysis of best practices and comparison of experiences. We intend to promote debate, insights, comparisons, research, and webinars in relation to the legal, economic, and social aspects associated with pandemics and linked not only to the emergency, but also to and recovery phases through an integrated and interdisciplinary approach. And next, please, with our network, several thematic focuses that represent our research paths, so government response, but also human rights, environment, cities, competition, digital society, taxation, healthcare system, public management, international organization, and international business. Next, please. Our network was kicked off with the conference held in July 2020 entitled COVID-19 and Cities, Building Resilience on Human Rights and Environmental Protection. During the conference, we set up 3 working groups, one on cities and human rights, one on cities and the environment, and one on cities and governance. This is next slide where I show our working group. Which is the one I'm going to talk about briefly. The working group is coordinated by Gianluca Crispi from UN Habitat and myself. I'm an adjunct professor of town planning and cultural heritage, regulatory framework, and of administrative law. We have organized meetings, webinars, and we are working on a report which is divided into 3 sections: institutional impacts, special impacts, and economic impacts of COVID-19 on cities and governance. The work of the group revolves around the Sustainable Development Goal number 11, but there are obviously strong relationships with the other goals, as it is an interdisciplinary research group formed by urban planners, legal experts, architects, experts in management. And next, please, maybe next. Okay, I will briefly talk about the approach. In the next slide, we can see that the research groups follows the theoretical approach of the GPN work in general, which is the one-off strategy, a strategy aimed at studying the effects of the pandemic with a view to the link between human health, animal health, and the environment. Such an approach allows us to lead the research towards common and integrated strategies, policies, and governance tools in a global perspective. This is next, please. Yes, bringing together different knowledge. And this strategy is also promoted at global level by global institutions. Next, please. The GPN started its activity, its academic activity from the study of CEDIS, because CEDIS are at the front lines and can concretely affect and innovate policies and legislation, as the previous speakers brilliantly explained us. So what stage has been reached in our group's research? Next, please. The working group conducted a progressive research process to address the issues related to the implementation of Goal 11. And next, we started with a seminar entitled in order to study the interactions in a comparative perspective in Brazil, India, and Spain. Then next, we address the issue of housing with 2 webinars, one on sustainable housing and one on housing for the vulnerable people. Next, we also opened a research line on sustainable mobility and the challenges of public transport in a post-pandemic city. And next, we talked about smart cities and technology solutions for urban health. This topic will be further explored next, please, in our next conference, organized in collaboration with scholars from the Technical University of Crete and experts from UN Habitat, where we will develop a strategy for the city of Cagnan in Crete for resilient and inclusive public space management, with the aim to export this strategy to other cities. All the GPN's research, next please, flows into a scientific journal, Legal Policy and Pandemics, the Journal of the Global Pandemic Network, which includes essays, a litigation section, reports from the working groups, and reviews. One of them is the brilliant work conducted by Mayra Tito on the effects of the pandemic in regional and local governance, in which she investigates Brazil as a case study and that she has just presented to us. So I don't want to steal more time. I invite next, please, all the potential stakeholders, individuals or institutions to become a member or partners of the network and to contribute to improve our research. Join us or email us for further information, and thank you all very much for attending. Thank you and bye.
Thanks. So thank you for all this nice perspective also on governance. I hope today we have demonstrated how technology and policy are two faces of the same medal, and that there are more and more interactions between them, and they are becoming also much easier. And also governance is shifting from the state to the international, to the local level much more frequently and in a much more fluid way. So I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, this workshop today. I invite you to send all the questions that you might have to in the question and answer box or to the experts directly. There should be a web page dedicated to our sessions with the contact details of each of the speakers who has delivered the presentation today. I thank very much UNITAR for the friendly support within this session, and all the attendants and all the speakers. And I wish you a very pleasant day and weekend. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.